My name is Renee Callahan. I'm 43 years old and I've spent the last 18 years doing the books for small businesses in Marion, a town where everybody's second cousin owes somebody money and I'm usually the one who finds out about it first. I found out about my own family the same way I find out about everyone else's, by looking at a number that didn't add up. It was a Tuesday in March, and I was sitting at my mother's kitchen table with her laptop open, trying to figure out why the home hospice company had sent a second invoice for a service that should have already been paid. My mother, Vivian, was 71 years old and 11 weeks into a diagnosis of stage 4 pancreatic cancer. And by that point in March, she slept most of the day and was awake, sharp in herself, for maybe 2 or 3 hours after dinner. I had power of attorney on paper, filed with an attorney in December, the kind of document you sign in a lawyer's office while trying not to look at your mother's face while she signs the other half of it. But my sister Dana had the debit card. That had been my mother's idea back when Dana was between apartments and needed, in my mother's words, something steady to hold onto. I hadn't fought it. Dana was going through a divorce. I told myself it was fine. I told myself a lot of things were fine that spring. The invoice said the March hospice payment had bounced. I pulled up the checking account to see why, expecting an oversight, a forgotten transfer, a scheduling mix-up with Social Security. What I found instead was a balance of $340.12 in an account that 6 weeks earlier had held just under $19,000. My mother's entire cushion, the money she and my father had put aside over 3 decades so that neither of their daughters would ever have to pay for her funeral or her care or anything else that comes at the end. I remember sitting very still. I remember the refrigerator humming. I remember thinking, with a kind of clarity that still surprises me when I look back on it, that I was not going to say anything to anyone until I understood exactly what I was looking at. That's the sentence I want you to remember, because it's the whole shape of what I am, and it's the reason this story ends the way it does. I don't yell, I don't accuse, I open a spreadsheet. Somewhere in the middle of that quiet, I understood something I would spend the rest of that spring proving with numbers instead of feelings, something I think is true for more families than just mine. Love that never has to answer for itself isn't love. It's just an unpaid invoice wearing a family photo. It took 4 days of quiet, careful work, bank statements downloaded at midnight after my mother was asleep, transaction histories cross-referenced against dates I remembered from group texts, screenshots saved to a folder labeled with the kind of dark joke I only made to myself, Q1 reconciliation, to understand what I was looking at. 11 withdrawals since January. Cash advances at 3 different ATMs, none of them near my mother's house. A recurring $340 charge to a boutique fitness studio 40 minutes away, in a town where my sister had just started renting an apartment with her new boyfriend. A $2,200 transfer, memo line blank, to an account that, when I looked it up against an old Venmo history, belonged to Dana's ex-husband's brother. A debt, I'd learn later, that had nothing to do with our mother and everything to do with a car repair from 11 months earlier. And on February 14th, 4 days after my mother's oncologist told us gently that we should think about hospice rather than another round of chemo, a $1,600 withdrawal that showed up nowhere else in Dana's life except 3 days later in a photograph she posted of herself in a resort in Sedona, captioned, "Sometimes you have to pour into yourself so you can pour into others later." I sat with that caption for a long time. I want to be fair here, because fairness is the only thing I have any control over in a story like this. My sister did not start out as a villain. Nobody does. Dana is 39, 2 years younger than me, and for most of our childhood she was the funny one, the pretty one, the one who could walk into a room and make my mother's face do something my presence never quite managed. I don't say that with bitterness, I say it because it's true and because it matters for what comes later. I loved my sister. In March, sitting at that kitchen table with a stranger's spreadsheet of my own mother's dying, some shrinking, stubborn part of me still did. But I also knew by the 4th night what I was looking at wasn't a mistake. A mistake is one withdrawal you can't explain. This was a pattern, and patterns don't happen by accident. Patterns are built, one reasonable-sounding justification at a time, by someone who has learned, probably over decades, probably starting long before I ever opened a laptop at that kitchen table, exactly how much a family will let them get away with if they cry at the right moment and call it love. I didn't confront her that week. I want to be honest about that because it would be easy to make myself sound braver in the retelling than I actually was. I closed the laptop. I made my mother tea. I sat with her while she watched a rerun of a game show she'd been watching since before I was born, and when she reached over and took my hand during a commercial break and said, "I don't know what I'd do without you two," I said, "You don't have to do anything, Mom. We've got you," and I meant every word of it, and I hated, more than I have ever hated anything, that I already knew one of us was lying. What I did instead that week and for the 11 weeks that followed was start a folder. If you're new here, welcome back, by the way, to anyone who's been with this channel a while. If you've ever been the one who was expected to fix everything and quietly clean up behind everyone else while somebody more charming got to keep their reputation intact, this story is for you, and I hope by the end of it you feel a little less alone in it. If it resonates, I'd love it if you drop a comment about your own version of this. I read every single one, and subscribe if you haven't, because there are more of these stories to come. Now, let me take you back to where all of this actually started, long before there was ever a spreadsheet, or a laptop, or a mother dying too slowly in a house that used to be loud with all four of us in it. Let me take you back to Marion in the early 1990s, to a small brick ranch house on Cherry Street with a swing set my father built in a weekend and never quite leveled, so that if you swung too high you drifted sideways into the fence. My parents, Vivian and Walter Callahan, were both school teachers. My mother taught second grade for 31 years. My father taught shop class until his heart gave out when I was 26, in a hallway outside his own classroom 10 minutes before the bell. There were two of us. I was born first in 1982. Dana came along in 1984, 2 years and 4 months later, and from what I've been told and from what I remember myself, something in the household shifted the moment she arrived, not unkindly, not in any way anyone could have named out loud at the time, but shifted all the same. I was, by every account, an easy child to overlook in the specific way that responsible children get overlooked. I made my bed without being asked. I brought home report cards that were good but never spectacular, because spectacular wasn't really the goal, steady was the goal. I remember being 9 years old and hearing my mother tell a neighbor with real pride in her voice, "Renee's my rock, I never have to worry about that one." I remember how good that felt, and how, even at 9, some part of me understood that being someone's rock also meant being something people didn't have to think about very hard. Dana was the one people thought about. She sang in the church talent show at 6 and brought the room to tears with a song about a dog that had died, a dog we never actually owned. She had a gift for being watched, a gift I didn't have and, if I'm honest, envied in a way I couldn't have articulated until I was well into adulthood. My mother used to say, laughing, indulgent, "That one's going to need looking after her whole life," as though it were a compliment, as though needing looking after were a form of specialness rather than a warning. Here is a specific memory, one of 3 I want to give you, because generalities don't tell you anything true about a family, only specifics do. I was 12, Dana was 10. Our elementary school held a fundraiser where kids sold gift wrap and candles door to door, and the top seller in the whole school won a bicycle. I sold $340 worth over 3 weekends, going block by block with an order form on a clipboard because I liked the structure of it, the tallying, the satisfaction of a column of numbers adding up to something real. Dana sold $60, mostly to our grandmother, and then cried for 2 days because a girl in her class had won the bicycle instead of her. On the 3rd day, my father drove to the bike shop and bought her one anyway, not the same model, a nicer one, and told her it was for effort. I still remember standing in the garage while he wheeled it in, waiting for someone to ask me what I wanted for my $340 worth of effort, and nobody did. And when I finally said something, my mother said gently, the way she said everything that was actually a closed door, "Renee, you don't need things the way Dana does. You're not like that." I was told, across a childhood of moments just like that one in 100 different specific configurations, that my steadiness was a kind of self-sufficiency, and that Dana's need was a kind of fragility that the rest of us existed to protect. Nobody said the second half of that sentence out loud. Nobody had to. By the time I was 17, I understood it as fact, the way you understand which floorboard creaks and where the sun hits the kitchen table in the morning, just a feature of the house I lived in. The second memory. I was 24, newly married, saving for a down payment on the house I still live in now. Dana was 22, 3 semesters into a cosmetology program she would eventually finish. In the middle of what our mother called a rough patch and what I would now, with the benefit of hindsight and about 400 nearly identical rough patches that came after it, call a pattern. She needed $1,800 for back rent or she'd be evicted. My mother called me on a Sunday night, and I remember the specific phrase she used because I would hear some version of it a dozen more times over the next 17 years. "You're in a better position than she is right now," not a request, a fact stated as though it settled something. I gave Dana the money. She paid me back $400 of it in 2 installments over the following year, and then the subject never came up again on either side, as though the remaining $1,400 had simply evaporated into the good faith of being family. The third memory is smaller, and it's the one that, looking back, tells me the most. I was 31, my father had been dead 5 years by then. Dana and I were cleaning out the garage on Cherry Street the summer my mother finally sold the house to move into something smaller, and we found a shoebox of my father's old shop class trophies, regional competitions he'd won as a teacher, things he'd never once mentioned to either of us. Dana held one up and said, quiet, unguarded in a way she rarely was, "I don't think Dad ever really saw me." Not really. And for one full minute, sitting on the concrete floor of that garage in the heat, I felt something in me soften all the way open toward her, because I understood in that minute that Dana had spent our whole childhood believing the exact opposite story I'd been telling myself. She thought she'd been overlooked. I thought I had. We were both right, and neither of us had ever said so to the other, and I remember thinking that day that if we could just keep talking like that, plain, unguarded, no audience, we might actually be able to be sisters instead of two people who'd been assigned opposite roles in the same house. There's a fourth memory I want to add here out of order, because it belongs with the other 3 even though it happened much more recently. In December, 3 months after my mother's diagnosis, the day we all sat in an elder law attorney's office to sign the power of attorney paperwork. The attorney, a soft-spoken man named Grover Adami, asked, as a matter of routine, whether my mother wanted to name one daughter or both as her agent. My mother answered without hesitating, "Renee, she's always been the one who handles things." Dana, sitting beside me, didn't argue, didn't look hurt, didn't even seem to register it as a moment worth reacting to, and I remember finding that at the time oddly comforting, a sign that we'd all simply accepted our assigned roles cleanly enough that there was no friction left to manage. It didn't occur to me until much later, sitting at that same kitchen table in March with a laptop open, that being formally excluded from financial responsibility might have landed on Dana not as relief, the way it landed on her in that office, but as one more quiet confirmation of an old story that she was the one who couldn't be trusted with anything that mattered, and that if the family had already decided that about her on paper, she might as well stop trying to prove otherwise and simply take what she believed she was owed by other means. I'm not offering that as an excuse. I want to be careful about that distinction throughout this whole story, the same distinction I'd eventually say out loud to Dana herself at that kitchen table. Understanding where a person's behavior comes from is not the same thing as excusing what it costs the people around them. But I think it matters that the December signing, the moment that felt to me like simple practicality, was also quietly the moment the last piece of the machinery clicked into place. We didn't keep talking like that the way we had on the garage floor. I want to tell you we did because it would make a better story. But 3 weeks later, she asked me for $600 for a business opportunity a friend had told her about, something to do with skincare products and a starter kit. And when I hesitated for the first time in 9 years of hesitating, she said, "Wow. Okay, I guess I know where I stand with you," and I gave her the $600 within the hour, and the shoebox of trophies and the one honest minute on the garage floor went back into the same drawer where I kept everything else about my sister that I didn't know what to do with. That's the shape of it, that's the machinery, if you want to call it that, and I will call it that later in this story, because by the time I understood it clearly enough to name it, I'd already spent 17 years as one of its moving parts. The machinery runs on two fuels: a story where Dana is fragile and needs protecting, and a story where I am strong and don't need anything at all. Both stories were built when we were children, by parents who loved us and never meant any harm, and both stories turned out to be extraordinarily convenient for exactly one person, for exactly one reason. They meant nobody ever had to ask Dana to change, and nobody ever had to ask me if I was tired. What I didn't understand yet, that Tuesday in March with the laptop open on my mother's kitchen table, was how far that machinery could run once the stakes stopped being $600 skincare kits and started being the very last money my parents ever managed to save. I was about to find out, and somewhere in the back of a kitchen drawer in a manila envelope I hadn't opened in 4 years, there was a document that was going to make sure I could prove every bit of it. If it's all right with you, before I take you further into this, I do want to say a genuine thank you for being here and sticking with these longer stories with me. It means more than you probably know, and if you're the kind of person who's spent your whole life being the reliable one, I hope you'll drop a line in the comments about your own family's version of this. I read all of them. All right, back to March. A note on what I do for a living and why it matters. I want to take one detour before I go back to the timeline because I think it explains something about how I was able to do what I eventually did and why it took me as long as it took. For 18 years, I've done bookkeeping and light forensic accounting for small businesses around Marion: a hardware store, 2 dental practices, a landscaping company, a family-owned diner that's been open since before I was born. What that work has taught me more than anything else is that almost every case of embezzlement or internal theft I've ever uncovered followed the same emotional arc, regardless of the dollar amount. The person doing it never thought of themselves as a thief. They thought of themselves as someone the business owed something to: an unpaid raise, an unacknowledged sacrifice, a debt the company had never formally recognized, but that felt to them completely real. The theft was never the first betrayal in their own telling. It was always a correction for an earlier one, real or imagined, that nobody else in the room had ever agreed existed. I used to find that pattern almost sad, in a professional, at arm's length sort of way, back when it only ever showed up in someone else's ledger. I never once, across 18 years of finding exactly this pattern in strangers' businesses, thought to look for it inside my own family, because families, I think, are the one place most of us assume the ledger simply doesn't apply. That love is supposed to exist outside of accounting, and that even suggesting otherwise is its own kind of betrayal. I don't believe that anymore. I think families run on ledgers just as often as businesses do. We just agree, collectively, not to call them that, and the people most protected by that agreement are almost always the ones who are already taking more than their share. Year 1, the first card. The withdrawals I found on that laptop in March didn't come out of nowhere. They came out of a decision my mother and I made together the previous October, 3 weeks after her diagnosis, when none of us were thinking clearly and all of us were trying to be useful in whatever way we knew how. My mother had just started her first round of chemotherapy. She was exhausted in a way I'd never seen her be exhausted, and she was scared, not of dying, she told me once late at night, but of becoming a burden, a word she used so often in those first weeks that I started flinching at it. Dana had by then moved back to Marion after her divorce finalized, into a 1-bedroom apartment she couldn't quite afford on a stylist's income. And she genuinely offered, I want to be fair about this, to be the one who drove our mother to appointments, since I was working full days doing books for 6 different clients and Dana's schedule, self-employed and flexible, could bend around chemo infusion times in a way mine couldn't. It made sense. It still makes sense when I lay it out like that. My mother added Dana to the checking account as an authorized user, not the power of attorney, not yet, just a debit card, so she can grab groceries or pay for parking without waiting on me to Venmo her back every time. I remember the exact sentence my mother used when she told me about it over the phone. It's just easier this way, honey. You've got so much on your plate already. I remember agreeing with her. I remember feeling, if I'm honest, a small flicker of relief that something, anything, had been taken off my plate without my having to ask. The first withdrawal I can trace with total confidence to something other than groceries or parking happened on November 9th. $85 at a nail salon, on a day my mother had a chemo infusion and, according to the calendar I keep for her medications, was home by 2 p.m. feeling too nauseated to eat dinner. I didn't know about it at the time. I only found it in March, going backward. When I texted Dana about it later, much later after everything she said without missing a beat, that was for Mom. She likes her nails done before appointments, it makes her feel human. My mother, when I gently asked her about it in a completely different context weeks after that, said she couldn't remember the last time she'd had her nails done and that chemo made her fingertips too sensitive for polish remover. That's the kind of lie Dana tells, not the kind where the story falls apart if you look at it twice, the kind that sounds so reasonable, so plausible, so consistent with the character everyone had already assigned her that you feel almost rude for checking. By December, the withdrawals had a rhythm to them. Something every 8 to 12 days, usually between $60 and $150, cash or a small purchase, never enough on its own to raise an alarm, always explainable with a sentence that started with "Mom wanted" or "Mom needed." I want to be precise about something here because I think it matters. I don't believe even now that Dana thought of what she was doing in November and December as stealing. I think she thought of it as borrowing against a debt she felt the family owed her, the felt debt of having always been the one who was struggling. The one people worried about, which had somehow, over 17 years, calcified into an entitlement she never examined out loud, not even to herself. There is one piece of dialogue from that December that I want to put down exactly as I remember it, because it's the first time I heard the sentence that would become the backbone of everything Dana said to me for the next 5 months. We were in my mother's kitchen, the two of us, washing dishes after a Sunday dinner, and I mentioned carefully, not accusingly, genuinely just making conversation, that I'd noticed the checking account was running lower than I expected. Dana didn't get defensive. She dried her hands on the towel, looked at me with an expression I can only describe as patient, the way you'd look at someone who was missing an obvious point, and said, "Renee, family takes care of family. I'm here every single day. You're not. Somebody has to actually be present, and being present costs something too, you know." I didn't have an answer for that in December. It sounded on its surface like something true. Presence does cost something. I had spent 17 years believing my own steadiness meant I didn't need anything back for the cost it exacted from me, so I had no framework in that moment for recognizing that my sister had just built a moral argument for spending our dying mother's funeral money on manicures. I let it go. I told myself I'd keep an eye on it. That's the sentence I want you to remember for later, the internal one this time. I told myself I'd keep an eye on it, the way you tell yourself you'll deal with a leak in the roof once the season changes, while the water keeps finding its way in regardless of what season it is. Year 2, if you can call 11 weeks a year, January through early March. I'm going to call these chapters years the way I originally thought about them in my head that spring, even though the whole span from my mother's diagnosis to the day I found that spreadsheet was really only 5 months. It felt like years. Grief compresses and expands time in ways that don't match a calendar, and I think anyone who has sat with a parent through a terminal diagnosis will understand what I mean when I say that January of that year felt longer than entire decades that came before it. By January, my mother's decline had accelerated in a way none of us were prepared for, even though every doctor had told us gently and repeatedly to prepare for exactly this. She stopped driving herself anywhere. She started sleeping 12, 14 hours a day. The hospice conversation happened on January 22nd. I remember the date because it's the day I started keeping a folder on my phone labeled Mom Medical, originally just for appointment notes and medication schedules, the folder that would later, without my planning it, become the folder where I also started saving screenshots of bank statements, because by January the two things had become, in practice, the same folder. The record of what it cost in every sense to keep my mother comfortable while she died. The financial pattern didn't slow down when my mother's condition worsened, it sped up. This is the detail I want to be exact about, because I think it's the detail that turned what had been a slow erosion into something I can only describe now as theft. On January 22nd, the same day we sat in an oncologist's office and heard the words supportive care for the first time, there was a $310 cash withdrawal from an ATM 11 miles from my mother's house, in the same shopping plaza as Dana's boyfriend's apartment. I don't think that's a coincidence. I have stopped over the course of this story being willing to call anything about that spring a coincidence. There was one transaction from late January I want to describe on its own, because it's the largest single withdrawal in the entire 5 months and the one that, looking back, should have ended my silence months before it actually did. On January 29th, a week after the hospice conversation, $4,100 moved out of my mother's account in a single transfer to a payday-style installment lender, the kind that advertises on late-night television with a jingle instead of an interest rate. I didn't understand at first why Dana would have taken out a loan in our mother's name rather than simply withdrawing cash the way she had every other time. It took me until March, cross-referencing loan servicer names against old mail I found stacked, unopened in Dana's car during a grocery run I'd offered to help her with, to understand what had actually happened. Dana had co-signed a $4,100 debt consolidation loan for her boyfriend the previous autumn, before our mother's diagnosis, using her own credit as collateral. When he stopped making payments in January, the lender came after Dana directly, and Dana, 3 days after learning our mother likely had months rather than years left, transferred the exact amount needed to satisfy that loan out of our mother's account and into her own. Then paid the lender from there, creating, deliberately I now believe, one extra transaction between the theft and its destination, specifically so that a casual glance at either account taken alone wouldn't show the full amount moving in one traceable line. I want to sit with that specific detail for a moment because it's the first piece of evidence I found that made me start using the word premeditated in my own head weeks before the resealed envelope made the word unavoidable. Splitting a transaction into 2 hops isn't something a person does out of impulse or emotional overwhelm. It's something a person does when some part of them already understands, clearly enough to plan around it, that what they're doing wouldn't survive being looked at directly. February brought the $2,200 transfer to Dana's ex-husband's brother, the car repair debt I mentioned earlier, a debt Dana would later describe to me when I finally raised it as basically an emergency. Renee, you don't understand what it's like to not have a safety net the way you do. I want to sit with that sentence for a second, because it's a perfect specimen of the machinery I keep talking about. I have a safety net, in Dana's telling, because I built one over 18 years dollar by careful dollar, turning down vacations and driving a car 9 years past when I could have afforded a new one, specifically so that I would never have to be the kind of person who needed to raid her dying mother's account for a car repair. In Dana's telling, my safety net wasn't evidence of a choice. It was evidence of a privilege that made my mother's remaining money, by some unspoken logic, more legitimately hers to access than mine to protect. There's one more incident from February I want to include, because it's the one that first made me start saving screenshots instead of just noticing numbers and moving on. My mother had asked Dana on a Tuesday to pick up a specific prescription, an anti-nausea medication that had to be paid for out of pocket that month because of an insurance authorization delay, $94 at the pharmacy counter. Dana came back that evening without the medication and without an explanation beyond the pharmacy was being weird about it. I'll try again tomorrow. I checked the account 2 days later, out of habit by then more than suspicion, and found a $94 charge at that same pharmacy on that same Tuesday, time-stamped 20 minutes after Dana had left our mother's house, followed 40 minutes after that by a $94 charge at a different retailer entirely, a home goods store on the other side of town. My mother never did get that prescription filled that week. She went 3 additional days nauseated and unable to keep food down before I drove to the pharmacy myself, on a day Dana wasn't scheduled to be there, and paid for it a second time out of my own account without ever mentioning to my mother that it had already technically been paid for once. That was the night I made the folder, not the Q1 reconciliation joke name folder from March, an earlier one, plain, unlabeled except for a date, sitting in my Photos app for 3 weeks before I even admitted to myself what I was building it for. There was warmth in those months too, and I don't want to leave it out, because leaving it out would make this less true, not more dramatic. My mother's neighbor, a widower named Harold who lived 2 doors down on Cherry Street since before either of us was born, started coming by twice a week with soup he clearly couldn't season correctly, sitting with my mother for an hour so I could run errands, never once asking for anything in return, never once making it about himself. My daughter Maya, who was 9 that spring, started a ritual of calling her grandmother every night at 7 p.m. exactly for exactly 10 minutes, to read her a chapter from whatever book she was working through at school. And my mother, who slept through almost everything else by February, was reliably, mysteriously awake and alert for those 10 minutes every single night, as though some part of her had decided that this, at least, she would be present for. I want you to hold onto Harold and Maya because they matter later in ways I couldn't have predicted that spring. Around the midpoint of all this, if you're finding any part of your own story in mine, I'd really encourage you to drop it in the comments below. And if you haven't yet, go ahead and subscribe because I have more of these to share and I'd love to have you along for them, around the midpoint. In early February, my mother's oncologist told us in the same appointment where he first said the word hospice out loud that we should start thinking realistically about her remaining time in terms of months, not years. I remember driving Dana back to her apartment afterward, both of us silent, and I remember Dana saying, staring out the window, "I don't know how to do this without her." And I remember believing completely that she meant it, and I remember reaching over and squeezing her hand at a red light, and I remember 3 days later the $1,600 Sedona withdrawal. I think both of those things were true about my sister at the same time. I think she loved our mother genuinely in whatever way she was capable of loving someone. And I think she also, at the exact same time in the exact same week, believed that her own comfort was a reasonable thing to extract from a dying woman's savings, because somewhere in the machinery she'd inherited from our childhood, comfort had never been something Dana was expected to provide for herself. A chapter I almost left out, the 10 years before the diagnosis. I want to pause the timeline here because if I only tell you about the 5 months of my mother's illness, I think I'll leave you with the impression that Dana became someone else under pressure, that grief made her do something she never would have done otherwise. I don't believe that's true, and I think it matters that I don't believe it, so let me give you the decade that came before, briefly, in the specific incidents I still have documentation for, because I have always, without quite admitting it to myself, kept records of my sister the way other people keep photo albums. In 2014, the year Dana turned 30, she asked our parents to co-sign a $14,000 loan for a hair salon suite she wanted to lease independently. My father, then 68 and 2 years from his own death, co-signed it without telling me until after it was done. The salon suite lasted 11 months before Dana fell behind on rent and walked away from the lease. And my parents absorbed $6,400 of the remaining loan balance rather than let it go to collections and damage her credit. A fact I only learned 4 years later, by accident, when I was helping my mother reorganize her filing cabinet and found the loan discharge paperwork. In 2017, Dana's wedding, a wedding that lasted, as a marriage, 3 years and 2 months, cost my parents $22,000 of the total $31,000 bill. A fact I know precisely because I was the one who built the spreadsheet tracking vendor deposits at my mother's request, because your father and I can't keep it all straight and you're so good with numbers. I want to note. Because it's relevant later that I built that spreadsheet for free over 4 months, unpaid, the same way I would build a much more consequential spreadsheet 6 years later, and that nobody in my family has ever once used the word unpaid about anything I've done for them. Because unpaid labor from the reliable daughter has never in 39 years been treated as labor at all. In 2015, the year after the salon suite collapsed, Dana asked our mother for $3,100 to cover a repossessed car, a Honda she'd financed against advice from our father, who had quietly wanted to co-sign her a smaller loan on a used vehicle instead and been talked out of it by my mother, who said, "Let her have something nice for once, Walter. She works hard." My father paid the $3,100 out of his own retirement fund, not the joint account, a distinction I only understood the significance of years later, when I realized he'd been quietly protecting my mother's share of their savings from Dana's requests for at least a decade before either of his daughters ever noticed him doing it. In 2019, 6 months before my father's fatal heart attack, Dana asked me directly, not our parents, me, for $900 to cover a plane ticket to a wellness retreat a friend had invited her to, framing it as an investment in finally getting my mental health together so I can stop being a burden on everyone. I gave it to her. Partly because the phrase, "stop being a burden," landed exactly where it was aimed, in whatever part of me had spent 37 years absorbing the idea that my sister's well-being was, in some unspoken way, my department. She posted 11 photos from that trip. I never once saw a repayment, a thank you beyond a single text that said "you're a lifesaver," folded hands, or any acknowledgement ever again that the trip had come from me and not from some general, faceless pool of family generosity that nobody was ever expected to trace back to a specific person's account. In 2020, during the divorce, Dana moved back in with our parents for 7 months, contributing nothing toward utilities or groceries, an arrangement my mother described to me at the time as just temporary, just until she's back on her feet. A phrase I would hear in one form or another at least 4 more times over the following 4 years. Here is the dialogue I remember most clearly from that whole decade, because it's the sentence that finally made the pattern visible to me, even though it would take 3 more years for me to act on what I'd seen. It was Thanksgiving, 2021. I'd made an offhand comment, not even a pointed one, just tired, just human, about how nice it must be to always land on your feet. Dana didn't get angry. She looked at me, genuinely puzzled, the way you'd look at someone who'd said something in a language you almost understood, and said, "Renee, you say that like it's luck. Do you know how exhausting it is to always be the one people worry about? You get to just be fine. I have to perform needing help so people don't forget I'm still struggling. That's a job too, you know." I didn't understand that sentence in 2021. I wrote it off as Dana being Dana, dramatic, self-justifying the way she'd always been. It's only now, looking back from the other side of everything that happened with my mother, that I understand what she was actually telling me plainly out loud at a Thanksgiving table. That she had learned somewhere very early that her value in this family was contingent on being seen as someone who needed rescuing, and that the actual state of her finances had become almost beside the point. What mattered was maintaining the performance that kept the rescue coming. That's the machinery. I want to name it clearly the way I promised myself I would somewhere in this story. My sister was not simply taking money. She was maintaining a role she'd been cast in before either of us could talk. A role that required her to keep needing things in order to keep being loved the way she understood love to work. And our mother's illness, however much Dana also grieved it, and I do believe she grieved it, was, to some deep and probably not fully conscious part of my sister, simply the biggest stage that role had ever been given. Year 3, such as it was, the weeks right after I started watching. I didn't stop the pattern by finding it. That's a detail I think people misunderstand about stories like this one. You assume that once someone in a family notices, the behavior slows down out of guilt or fear of being caught. It didn't, not for Dana, and I've thought a lot about why. I think it's because Dana genuinely didn't believe, on any level she examined, that what she was doing constituted noticing something. She believed she was managing a resource the family had always implicitly agreed she had more claim to than the rest of us on account of needing it more, and nothing about my quiet watching in March changed that underlying belief, because I hadn't said anything yet to disturb it. So the withdrawals continued into the second half of March, the same rhythm, the same size, the same texture of justification. There was a $220 charge at a spa on March 19th, 4 days after my mother's white blood cell count came back low enough that her oncologist restricted visitors to immediate family only for 2 weeks, a restriction that meant Dana, by her own account to me, was basically living at that house. Renee. Someone has to decompress. There was a $175 grocery run on March 24th at a store 40 minutes from my mother's neighborhood, nowhere near either of our houses, that matched, when I checked it against her public location tags, a strip mall beside the gym Dana had started attending with her boyfriend. I want to give you one more piece of dialogue from this period, because it's the moment I came closest to breaking my own silence before I was ready, and understanding why I didn't is part of the story too. My mother, on a rare good afternoon in late March, sitting up in the recliner in her living room with a quilt over her knees, asked me, out of nowhere, whether I thought Dana was doing all right, really, underneath everything. I said I wasn't sure. My mother said, I worry sometimes that we made her believe struggling was the only way to get our attention. I look back at some of what your father and I did, and I wonder if we built that into her without meaning to. I sat with that sentence for a long time after I left that day, because it was the first time I heard my mother name any part of the machinery herself, unprompted, and it made the 6-week silence I still had ahead of me feel less like protecting her from a hard truth, and more like protecting a truth she was already circling on her own, in whatever time she had left to circle it. I want to describe one more exchange from this stretch because it's the clearest example I have of the specific rhetorical move Dana used over and over across 17 years whenever anything close to suspicion entered a room. My mother's regular in-home aide, a kind, precise woman named Josephina who came 5 mornings a week, mentioned to me in passing, not as an accusation, just as an observation, that she'd noticed the grocery deliveries seemed lighter than the receipts suggested they should be, half the ordered items sometimes missing from the actual bags. I brought it up to Dana carefully, the way I brought up everything in those months, framing it as a logistics question rather than a suspicion. Dana's answer came immediately without a beat of hesitation. Josephina probably just miscounts. She's sweet, but English isn't her first language, and I don't think she always follows the order confirmations. It was, I want to be clear, a completely plausible-sounding answer. It was also, I discovered 2 weeks later after quietly reviewing the delivery service's own order history myself, entirely false. Every single item on every receipt had in fact been delivered exactly as ordered, which meant the gap Josephina had noticed wasn't a delivery error at all. It was groceries leaving the house after they arrived, and a story constructed on the spot to make a woman with no power in that household sound like the unreliable one instead. That's the piece of this I think is worth naming clearly, out loud, the way I eventually said it to Dana herself. The machinery doesn't just protect itself by explaining away suspicion. It protects itself by quietly making someone else look less credible in the process, usually whoever has the least standing in the room to defend themselves. I have thought about Josephina more than once since that spring, and I made a point months later of telling her directly that I knew the gap had never been her fault. She said simply, I wondered, but it wasn't my place to say more than I already had. I think about that sentence too sometimes, how many people in my mother's life over those 5 months noticed something and decided reasonably that it wasn't their place, the same way I'd decided for 17 years before that spring that naming the pattern in my own family wasn't mine to do either. There was warmth in these weeks too, and I don't want the accounting to crowd it out entirely. My mother's favorite hospice nurse, a woman named Corinne who came 3 mornings a week, started bringing a small transistor radio and playing the big band records my mother had grown up on. And for 20 minutes at a time, twice a week, my mother would hum along, eyes closed, looking for those 20 minutes, less like someone dying and more like someone simply resting. Mark took over dinner entirely that month without my having to ask. A small, unglamorous kind of steadiness I don't think I fully appreciated until much later, once I understood how rare it actually is to be quietly taken care of by someone who never once makes you thank them for it. I want to close this stretch of the timeline with one exchange between Dana and me that I still turn over more than almost any other, because it's the moment I came closest to simply asking her directly before I was ready, before I had the full picture. We were folding my mother's laundry together on a Sunday afternoon in late March, a small domestic task neither of us had done side by side since we were teenagers, and Dana said apropos of nothing, "Do you ever feel like you're the only one who actually knows how to hold this family together?" I said something noncommittal, and she kept going, quieter. "I used to resent you for it. I think I still do, a little. But I also don't know what any of us would have done these last few months without you being exactly who you are." I remember standing there with a pillowcase in my hands, and I remember wanting so badly to tell her everything right then, the screenshots, the folder, the number that didn't add up. Because for one unguarded minute it felt like we were finally 2 sisters talking honestly instead of 2 people performing assigned roles at each other. I didn't say it. I told myself it wasn't the right moment, that our mother was napping down the hall and didn't need to wake up to raised voices. That was true. It was also, I understand now, one more instance of the same old habit, protecting everyone else's comfort in a moment that was actually asking me to protect the truth instead. By the time I opened that laptop in March, the account that should have held $19,000 held $340.12. And I had saved to a folder on my phone 11 dated screenshots, a medication calendar that could place my mother's condition and location on every single day in question, and a growing, quiet certainty that the woman I'd once sat with on a garage floor, believing we might finally understand each other, had spent 5 months treating our mother's death like a line of credit. I closed the folder. I didn't say anything to Dana. I didn't say anything to my mother, not yet, not beyond the promise I'd already made her that Thursday to carry this part. What I did that same week was call a woman named Patricia Ovadia, a family law attorney I'd worked with twice before, for 2 different bookkeeping clients going through business divorces, and ask her, in a voice I worked very hard to keep steady, what a person is supposed to do when they suspect a sibling is financially exploiting a parent who is actively dying, and whether the fact that I'd said nothing yet, out of some instinct to be certain before I was cruel, meant I'd already waited too long to do this right. Patricia's answer to that question is the reason this story ends the way it does instead of the way it could have, with me confronting my sister in anger, in a kitchen with nothing but a feeling and a hunch to back me up, and Dana crying, and my mother dying, being asked to referee one more time between her 2 daughters in the very last months she had left to referee anything at all. But that conversation with Patricia and everything that came after it, the part of this where I stopped being the one who kept the folder quiet and started being the one who built the case, that's part 2. Because 2 weeks after I called Patricia, my mother asked me out of nowhere on an ordinary Thursday evening, holding my hand the way she had that day months earlier during the game show commercial, "Renee, honey, has your sister asked you for money lately?" Because she asked me for something and I said yes before I thought about it, and I don't remember what I said yes to. And I understood in that moment that my mother already half knew, and that I had exactly as long as she had left to make sure the truth reached her in a way that was gentle, documented, and impossible to argue with, instead of reaching her the way most families let these things reach them: too late, too loud, and from the mouth of whoever's angriest.